So, everybody, welcome along another episode of In Conservation with. My name is David Lindo, also known as the Urban Birder. Today, my guest is Conor Jameson, a guy who I've known for some time actually. We'll talk about that in a second, but we're talking about something that I've always wanted to talk about. It's a conversation that I've always wanted to have. So, we're going to be talking about W.H. Hudson, a guy that you may not necessarily know straight away, but for me, he's one of the sort of main influences in my life as a natural historian. But we'll talk more about that shortly. Firstly, I have to announce that we have sponsors, and the first sponsor is Leica Sport Optic, and the second sponsor is CJ Wildlife, and they are a team of passionate nature lovers and experts in garden wildlife on a mission to make nature accessible for everyone, whether you are a nature novice or a garden guru. They want to inspire, educate, and provide the right tools to help wildlife thrive right on your doorstep. And I should really have learned that by heart now. I've been saying that for the last 20 episodes, but I still don't remember all the words. So anyway, enough said. Conor, how are you and where are you?
Hello, David. I'm very well, thank you. And I'm in North Cambridgeshire. I'm in a town called Wisbech, which is the capital of the Fens. And to place it geographically for birding types, it's right on the sort of edge of the wash, really, on the border with Norfolk and Lincolnshire. So a couple of hours north of you or London.
Well, in London, yeah, but I am actually not in London, despite
Oh,
my background. I'm in the capital of birding in Spain, as far as I'm concerned, which is Extremadura. But that's another subject.
nice.
Um, it is, yeah. Um, I've known you for some time. I can't remember when I first met you, actually. Do you?
I'm going to guess it was almost certainly a bird fair, but it could have been somewhere else, but probably bird fair, if
Yeah,
not the lodge.
probably, yeah. And let me just tell you, for those who don't know about Connor, who he is. Connor Mark Jameson. Do you actually go by that, or you just call him Jameson?
Well, I inserted the mark for book writing purposes because there's a Conor Jameson in America who's a sort of a cartoon action hero, and I didn't want people to get mixed up.
Yeah, there could be a problem there. Yeah, absolutely. I can see that. It's interesting because my name is David James Lindo, and for years I've been thinking, should I just, become more kind of, um, sophisticated and call myself David James Lindo
Yeah.
and have my
I,
books
I
like,
noted that your dad had a middle initial.
God, you've been doing some research on me.
I just read your book.
Yeah,
I read it
his name is Edgar. His name was Edgar James Lindo. So
yeah.
he gave me the James.
Yeah. No, definitely it's a literary thing, isn't it? To insert something like that, and but I think it also has a kind of haiku. It possibly gives a kind of haiku tempo to your name as well if you add a couple of more syllables. But
Yeah. Well, I was going to add another one because I was raised a Catholic, and when I was confirmed, I chose my name, and my name was Francis,
ooh,
Francis of Assisi. So
nice.
it's David James Francis Lindo, if you want the full on
Well,
thing. Not
that's
bad.
got a nice ring.
But anyway, Connor is a writer, naturalist. He is the author of books, including Silent Spring Revisited, Shrew Done It, and the one that I know the best, Looking for the Goshawk. His current project is a book about the life and times of W.H. Hudson. Connor is also a feature writer and has written for television and radio, which is very interesting. Are you doing anything at the moment? You working on anything at the moment?
In the broadcast sense.
Yeah.
No, no. I mean, the TV stuff I did almost in a previous life in Bristol at the Natural History Unit, before I got sort of absorbed into sort of conservation. and the radio stuff. I did a Rachel Carson documentary. Must be a couple of years ago now, in a Radio 4 series. So that's, I mean, when asked, I'll do it, but it's not something that I kind of I can proactively do. Although I'm hoping that if I can get Hudson back on the radar, that there'll be some interest from program makers.
Yeah.
Anyway,
That's fascinating because screenwriting is a completely different discipline anyway. And it's interesting because I did a screenwriting course about 17 years ago, 18 years ago in Los Angeles. And I was working, in fact, my mate, I worked with him. He was a director. He'd actually written this script and I'd sort of helped him, but not much. But we went on this thing together as a team. And there were several other people there as well as partnerships, working on their movies. And it was the first time I was ever told that I could write because the teacher said to me, or to all of us, okay, I want you all to write a story, beginning, middle, and end in 6 sentences. Go. And I wrote this thing, and I was the only person in the room that wrote a story. And she said, you can write. And I said, me? You're joking, really? But, years later,
yeah.
I may not still be a writer, but I may still not be a writer even. But anyway, that's how things work. Anyway, going back to you, Conor. You worked for the RSPB and BirdLife International for 25 years, and I've obviously met you down in the corridors of the lodge, and has also worked for the Scottish Wildlife Trust. Conor describes himself as a Scots-Irish and Ugandan born, and improbable as it may sound, he now lives in a forest clearing in Fenland, North Cambridgeshire, UK. So you're quite a mix of a man, aren't you, really?
Well, yes, I suppose. Sort of in terms of my origins, yeah. Sort of lived half my life in England now. Obviously, with a Scottish background, but Irish parents. And the Uganda thing was my folks moved to Uganda in the late 50s. My dad was teaching, and all of us, me and my 4 siblings, were all born there. And after 10 years, my folks came back, not to Ireland, but to Scotland. And so yeah, it goes from there. So yes, and I mean, I've been down here since the mid-90s.
What part of Ireland, may I ask?
Well, my dad sort of traces his family to Mayo, County Mayo, and Sligo, and my mum to Derry.
Okay.
So
interesting. It's quite interesting because when you talk about your roots, I mean, for a long time I thought I was a product of the British Empire, when you sort of extrapolate back. But now I've come to think that actually I'm maybe a product of the Spanish Empire.
Oh.
Because my parents were born in Jamaica, and I think obviously all the Africans came from Africa, from West Africa, shipped over to the West Indies. And at the time, Jamaica was run by the Spanish, briefly.
Yeah.
And during that period of time, the slave holders, or whatever you want to call them, sometimes would name their slaves. And Lindo is an Iberian, Spanish, Portuguese word,
Yeah.
Which means handsome, colourful, and gay, and gay in a colourful sense. And basically, it suddenly dawned on me. I thought, actually, because the Spanish were then kicked out by the British. So really, if I was from Britain, or not influenced by Britain, my name would have been more kind of anglicised.
Yeah.
No, it's Lindo. So it's interesting, and this kind of ties in very, very neatly with W.H. Hudson, because
Yeah.
You know what? I think it might be an idea if you introduce us to him, because then our conversation, people will kind of, for those who don't know who he is,
Yeah.
they can sort of tie into what we're trying to say here.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, yeah. Well, that segues neatly into the whole Hispanic and it kind of I suppose global migration story and themes that Hudson kind of introduces. So I'm sharing screen then.
You share the screen, and for those Zoomers not familiar with the process, it's always best when you're watching a presentation to look at it on speaker view.
Okay.
There you
So
go.
I mean, if you want to, you can obviously stop me at any time, David, if you want to kind of.
I'll only stop you if you start talking for longer than an hour.
Look, I promise you, I'm going to try and do this in half an hour, and it's much less than I normally take. So I guess I apologize in advance if I'm skimming a bit, but I guess anything that people want to know more about, then we can chat. But there is a lot to say about this chap. So anyway, restoring W.H. Hudson or finding W.H. Hudson is the project, and sometimes the arrow keys don't work.
That's the problem. It all works in rehearsal, and then come the day when the lights, camera, action, it just doesn't move.
So,
Have you tried? What are you trying?
arrow key.
Okay, why don't you use your cursor, your mouse? You got a mouse?
I've got one here.
You got a trackpad? Yeah,
Yeah.
you should be able to see something you can click on to move forward, or even click on that. There you go.
Oh, gotcha. Right, it moved. Sorry. Slide 2. Subtitle: the writer who came to Britain to save the birds. We agonized for quite a long time to come up with these titles, so I do hope you like them. This is Hudson as a young man. We've already covered this, but I put this wee map in to place us geographically. It basically shows you the life of the black-headed gull that I found dead at the wash. And in 2 years, it had done a foraging trip to the Baltic there at Gdansk and back. It had been ringed in at an Essex landfill site. Anyway, most of you are probably in where the green balloon is. I'm where the grey balloon is, and the gull helps remind us that birds know no boundaries. David's covered this as well. Yeah, just in terms of my background as a writer, these are my books, and I suppose what I would draw out from this is I'm a sort of a fighter of if you like, lost causes or unsung heroes. The goshawk being one, Rachel Carson being another, and so I think Hudson sort of completes the trilogy really. So yes, the lodge. I went for a seasonally appropriate image of the lodge, Sandy, RSPB headquarters, and this is it in summer. This is the main house, late Victorian building, and the main meeting room in the house is dominated by a painting above the old stone fireplace of the man, W.H. Hudson, William Henry Hudson, in his wool suit with his binoculars. And so in all the years I worked there, obviously this man was ever present, but curiously seldom spoken about. And I'll be honest, it wasn't until quite late in my time at RSPB that I, in a sense, started to get to know the man. And it was when I was researching the Goshawk book that I was finding Hudson was a bit of a kindred spirit and also a goshawk enthusiast, even though they were all gone when he was here. And he told a lovely story in that book, Birds and Man, about one evening he was sitting by a fire, much as I am now, and he was dozing off. There was a storm raging, and there was a stuffed green woodpecker and a stuffed red squirrel on the mantelpiece beside him. And as he dozed off, he started to have a nightmare, and the two stuffed animals came to life and started to talk, and they started to torment him. And they told him that when he died, he would go to hell, and like them, he would be stuffed and mounted, and he would have glass orbs inserted in his eye sockets, and he would be condemned to eternity to this sort of inanimate state with no voice. And it struck me that here he is beside a fireplace, almost life-sized, with no voice. Obviously, he's not stuffed and mounted. That would be strange. But anyway, it became a bit of a mission to give Mr. Hudson his voice back. So I guess I would also have assumed that Hudson was a typical collector naturalist of the era, and probably owned a big house like the lodge. But of course, nothing could be further from the truth. And I discovered that, as his friend, the war poet Edward Thomas, who was killed on the Western Front in 1917, neatly put it, Hudson did an unusual thing. He was born in South America. And so the plot thickens. I'm already, I'm kind of hooked. I want to know more about this fella. And far from being wealthy, Hudson was actually born here. And this is the derelict house that he was born in when it was rediscovered in the 1930s. And he grew up in this wonderful environment. He had a sort of semi-feral childhood. His parents were quite, easygoing liberals. They were North American. They'd emigrated to South America to try ranching. And so young Hudson, with his 5 brothers and sisters, had this life, and he never had to go to school. So he's uneducated, although he wasn't illiterate because they had a quite well-stocked bookcase at home. So anyway, he was a self-taught naturalist and a bird lover from a very early age. So I'm kind of fast forwarding through a very, very interesting young life of Hudson and adolescent life, and some life-changing moments where he, developed illness that left him with a weakened heart, and an accident with a pistol in which he shot himself in the knee, which I think might have left him a little bit hobbled. But basically, when he was 32, nearly 33, he decided that his life or his fortunes lay abroad. He'd established some links with the Zoological Society in London, with whom he'd been corresponding and sending bird skins. He discovered 2 new species. And so one April morning in 1874, he boarded a boat and he made the month-long Atlantic crossing to seek his fortune. He landed at Southampton, which I've ringed there, and he was destined for London to meet the Zoological Society there. And his initial dealings with some very eminent ornithologists and scientists didn't go especially well. And I think it dawned on him quite quickly that his lack of education, but also his complete lack of knowledge beyond what he'd read in poetry books and in the Nature of Selborne, etc., didn't equip him for a career in ornithology or certainly science. And so I think this left him a bit, basically he was down and out, and he was sleeping rough in Hyde Park for a time. He was running out of money, and he would probably have had to go home had he not met the woman that he married. And then followed 10, 15 years of really difficult poverty and lack of work. Again, I can only skim over that, but his fortunes changed when he finally started, after years in the British Museum Library, teaching himself about, wildlife and nature here. He started to have some publishing breakthroughs. But the big turning point was when he happened to fall in with Eliza Phillips and the women who were getting organized to create what he always called the Bird Society, what we know today as the RSPB. Now, happily, Eliza's story and the story of the other women, so far as we can piece it together, has been nicely told by Tessa Bowes, who David obviously had the chat with not long ago. And so, in a sense, what I've done is been able to follow up on that and help, I think, put some more flesh on those bones through the story of W.H. Hudson. And that's kind of my mission, is through his life, through the narrative, if you like, device of him as the main protagonist. It helps to, I hope, bring to life not only him, but the people around him. And so what always intrigued me was that Hudson was the only man in the room that there was a man at all, but that they would want him there. And not only that they would want him there and tolerate him, but that he wanted to be there. And I think it speaks very much of how Hudson was an outsider. So he didn't care about the conventions of here. And what makes Hudson tick is this very kind of clear-eyed perspective he has almost on Britain and British culture. So he's a fascinating character from that point of view, considering his origins. He was a big bloke, big sort of, 6'3", fella who'd essentially lived the gaucho life for 20 years, and he'd arrived here, and he wasn't afraid of putting noses out of joint. Let's put it that way. But anyway, he found his people with Eliza, and what we've always thought of as the fur, fin, and feather folk of Croydon. Now, I actually think that they were first meeting not in Croydon, but in Notting Hill, from what I can judge from my researches. Anyway, another story. Name check to Emily Williamson, who simultaneously was establishing the Society for the Protection of Birds in Manchester, and the two merged soon after in the early 1890s. And Etta Lemon, as Tessa has talked you through, and you'll hopefully have seen her book, would obviously then sort of drive the thing forward over the next, 50 years. And the aristocracy, represented by Winifred, Duchess of Portland, all-round good egg, who would also retain that post until her death in the 1950s. Extraordinary service. So Hudson was put to use initially doing some of the scribing of the pamphlets, including Lost British Birds, in which he, from the information and knowledge he'd amassed in the museum library, he documented the catalogue, litany of loss that had happened here, which obviously he found, thoroughly, depressing. And simultaneously, he was his own success as an author was starting to grow. And we come back to this pamphlet at the end. And obviously, it's well rehearsed that, species like egrets in particular, but birds of all kinds were being decimated globally by this extraordinarily huge industry. I mean, so taking this industry on cannot be overestimated as a challenge. Imagine sitting around a drawing room in Notting Hill saying, right, considering the power and the vested interests and the political, opposition they would face. Anyway, Hudson's gift was an ability to capture hearts as well as minds in what he wrote. Very powerful stuff, as well as, I think, being really quite rigorous in terms of accuracy and facts. And we didn't always get everything right, of course not, but anyway, he had a gift, certainly. And he wasn't afraid to write stinging letters about the plumage industry, but all sorts of other abuses of birds. It wasn't only about plumage. That the Times was only too happy to publish. And so some of his letters really made big ripples. And one of the things I found out about Hudson was that they made him chairman. He wasn't the first chairman. Eliza was the first chairman, but they made him chairman briefly in the early 1890s. And it became clear that he had what we might today call social anxiety. He couldn't and wouldn't do fine dining. He wouldn't do hobnobbing or networking, as we might call it now. So he just simply didn't do it. And nor could he speak on a public platform. He never once addressed an audience of adults. And so I think these facts combined with potential conflict of interest over his sort of independence as an author, and his kind of forthrightness, and I suppose his slightly lack of, political finesse, meant that he stepped aside from that and they let somebody else take over who was a much more of a committee man and much better cut out for that role and retained it right up till the end and got knighted for his trouble. Anyway, Hudson remained absolutely a activist in the organization until the end as well. I mean, he was pounding the pavements and he was haranguing local authorities and in order to get local bird protection orders in place, etc. And he was continuing to write. And I know this book means a lot to David. It was published in 1898 and remains a great read. Partly because Hudson is just so he's so uncompromising. The first 50 pages of this book are almost all about corvids. He loved them so much, and I think because they were so unusual, and he was so sympathetic to their cause. He loved jackdaws on cathedrals, and he loved magpies because there were like literally 3 in London, and he knew them all by personally. And it paints a picture of obviously of a fascinating time, and when the nesting of a wood pigeon was an event. Anyway, but the key thing is that, as he himself said, this isn't a book about just what birds you might find in London. This is a book with a purpose. The purpose of this book primarily was to go after the park authorities for their mismanagement of the green spaces of the city and this terrible culture, as he saw it, of over manicuring everything and not understanding, what wildlife needed. Anyway, he was threatened with a lawsuit and he was all for it. I also discovered that he and the Bird Society were instrumental in a big campaign at the turn of the century to save a huge chunk of Kew Gardens from development too. So there's all these things going on that are long forgotten. And I gave a talk at Kew about it because they'd long forgotten about it as well. So yeah, he had a big part in saving Kew and the old deer park. And again, interesting about Hudson is that his real forte was nature writing, as we'd call it now. But he tried his hand at novel writing. He wrote about the poverty that he'd witnessed in London's East End in this book. And he wrote science fiction. And he continued to write about what he remembered from his time in South America. So he continued to write those books as well. And despite his avowed distaste for hobnobbing, he was basically held in such high regard by people like Sir Edward Grey, a rising Liberal politician, that he became firm friends with Grey, and Grey was very helpful to him in lots of ways. So basically Hudson was sort of now rubbing shoulders with some of the kind of most eminent statesmen of the era, despite his reticence and famous kind of unwillingness to sort of put himself out there. He really was an extremely modest man. So anyway, Grey helped Hudson get citizenship and a civil list pension. So when Hudson turned 60 in 1901, he now had 150 quid a year coming in, which helped him a lot and enabled him to start doing more sort of excursions from London. I was also fascinated and thrilled to discover that Hudson also got absorbed by this literary circle with all these names that we do remember. People will remember Joseph Conrad and John Galsworthy. I mean, these were, the creme de la creme. At the centre of this luncheon club, and this is a restaurant in Soho, long gone, but that plaque is still there, was a literary agent, we might call him, called Edward Garnett, and he was the star maker of so many illustrious names like D.H. Lawrence and E.M. Forster and many more besides. And he held Hudson in particular high regard, both as a writer and as a man. So what I've tried to do is weave these strands together, because simultaneously the RSPB is going from strength to strength, becoming royal in 1904 and really going places. I have been conscious that people have just completely forgotten about Hudson. I've been thinking, of ways to kind of make him relatable. So happily, he has connections with half a dozen or more English counties, mainly in the south. And so I've been able to tell his story from the point of view of Norfolk and Cornwall and Wiltshire, which has been fun. And his pilgrimage to Breckland to pay homage to a poet, another long forgotten poet who influenced him when he was a boy. And again, he was adopted by this fascinating woman called Margaret Brooke, the Rani of Sarawak. I mean, it's a whole hour and a half in its own right. I can only skim over this so that you understand. But she adopted him. She was a literary hostess. And again, she held him in higher regard than anyone. She'd long fallen out with Oscar Wilde, and she was friends with Edward Elgar and Henry James and all sorts of people, but it was Hudson she loved the most. And they hung out together for a long time from the Edwardian era. So it was there was a brief but nice kind of golden age, wasn't there? And obviously Hudson's story takes us through World War One and all the things that happened there and happened to his friends and happened to, society. And again, fast forwarding to the end of the war, Hudson had been very ill himself at the end of the war, and he was getting on. He was getting towards 80 years old. And the happy part, I mean, spoiler alert, but hey, the war ends. Hudson's furiously trying to write more books and finish things, and still campaigning like mad with the Bird Society. And the happy part is 100 years ago this year, the Plumage Act became law. So he lived just long enough to see this after, let's remember, 33 years of campaigning. So imagine the effort, the doggedness of these folk. The other thing that happened was the first meeting was held in London in June of what we now know and love as BirdLife International. And again, I can sort of plot that through Hudson's movements, which has been nice to do. He stepped aside. He knew that now it was for others to take forward. But of course, yeah. And his legacy, literal legacy, was, as well as his sort of metaphorical legacy, his literal legacy was he left everything. His wife predeceased him by a year. And he left everything to the Bird Society. And he amassed as much money as he could towards the end of his life, mainly because he'd broken America from American publishers and filmmakers. And he left it all to ETA and the Bird Society. And he wanted them to really go after the private collectors and to get private collecting made illegal. That was one of the things he wanted his money to be put towards. And the other was education. And they had a bit of a negotiation. I think ETA got him to loosen some of his conditions. And he had an unfinished project. He actually had two. But the one I'll tell you about was this book version of that pamphlet he'd written right at the start about the lost birds. And he wanted this now to become a big full color book, now that, technology had moved on and books could have these wonderful color illustrations. And so he paid for all of this himself. And he updated it. But he ran out of time. And so it was lovingly completed for him by Linda Gardner, who was a very close friend of his, and she was the Bird Society's editor and assistant to ETA from the turn of the 20th century. And that's a beautiful book, telling the story of these wonderful things that we'd gone and allowed ourselves to lose. So by the end, Hudson, he passed away in August 1922 alone, and he'd been on his feet till his dying day in London, running around trying to take care of business and meeting all these people he now knew. 24 volumes in his complete works. One of the things I've been doing this year is establishing a collection at King's Lynn Library. King's Lynn was a town he loved, and he was, of course, very attached to Norfolk. And the funny part, the footnote, is that all these people who knew and loved him formed a committee and commissioned Jacob Epstein, who was the eminent sculptor of the day. He'd done Oscar Wilde's tomb in Paris, and they commissioned him to make a monument to Hudson, and they were granted permission to have a chunk of London's premier royal park, Hyde Park, to install this monument, as well as create a bird sanctuary. So this is Epstein at work. And in 1925, a huge crowd gathered to see no less than the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, seen on the left here, unveil this monument. The funny part is that there was a huge kerfuffle. The sheet came off the monument, and Baldwin was sort of had to double take. He was he was gobsmacked too, and the crowd was shocked and astonished to find that Epstein had sculpted Rima, who is the bird girl heroine from Hudson's best-selling novel Green Mansions. Rima isn't wearing very much. Basically, she's naked from the waist up, and there was a almighty furore. And the Daily Mail ran a campaign to have the Hyde Park monstrosity removed, and it ran for months. Anyway, again, there's probably a whole talk in this saga itself. I'm happy to say that if you go to Hyde Park today, if you haven't done this already, you can find Rima and the Hudson Memorial. I had fun. I first did this just over a decade ago, when I kind of was first on the trail of Hudson. And I went there. I was in London one May afternoon, and I arrived in Hyde Park. First of all, the tourist kiosk gave me this map, but weren't able to tell me where the monument actually was. So, and it's not on there. So anyway, I was wandering around, and I found there was a queue about a mile long of people waiting to get their hands on the Champions League trophy. The final was being played at Wembley that evening. And I was sort of, nope, my search focus remained Hudson and Rima. Anyway, and that evening, Lionel Messi, that other famous Argentine, lifted the Champions League at Wembley. But I'm happy to say that I found Rima and this wonderful little bird sanctuary. And there she is, this glorious Portland stone avant-garde monument. Again, what's fascinating is that this was a collision of moments between the traditionalists who hated this kind of art and the modernists who loved it, and it was a kind of political sort of flashpoint, I suppose, as well. Anyway, poor Hudson in the midst of it, and I don't know what he'd have made of it, but I always think he would probably just have said, could you not just have given the money to the birds? Anyway, I also went and found Hudson's main London home, the one he lived in for most of his life here, at Westbourne Park. It had scaffolding up when I went. And then the other, I suppose, the positive note I try to leave all this on is that Hudson's lost birds, where are they now? If Hudson walked in the room, we would be able to tell him some good news. And that would, I think, surprise him a lot. And of course, we could tell him about BirdLife International and the fact that there's an Argentine partner organization in Buenos Aires, close to where he grew up. And a few years ago, we collaborated with our partner. Incidentally, I meant to mention that Hudson was campaigning on albatrosses at the turn of the 20th century as well, literally writing to the newspapers about people deliberately catching them on fishing lines from ocean liners. Anyway, he didn't mind who he upset. Anyway, here we are in the house meeting room, working on this project supported by Bird Fair to raise funds to create a national park in Argentina, close to where Hudson grew up. And this is the Argentine embassy. And I, in return, went to Buenos Aires and visited our colleagues there at their office. and discover that they have a library named after Hudson, and they have more Hudson stuff even than the RSPB, and the man is still revered there. I went to the Marchiquita, and they took me in a wee aeroplane. They told me that this aeroplane was older than me, and I wasn't sure whether that was reassuring or not. Anyway, I'm still here. So we went over the Marchiquita and we saw this fabulous, enormous shallow salt lake that's vitally important for an amazing range of birds, 3 species of flamingo on the Americas Flyway. And the happy part is, yes, the national park is all go. And so I was able to have articles published in Birdwatching magazine, etc. And one of the other highlights, of course, of the trip was my colleagues said, right, we'll take you to find Hudson's birthplace. And they stuck me in a car and we drove past the harbour that he left in 1874 and see if you can spot the clues in the landscape when you're looking for Hudson's home. There's a whole district of Buenos Aires named after the man. And you finally arrive on the outskirts of town. It's a vast city now, 15 million people. It was smaller than Southampton when Hudson left there. Anyway, here's the reserve, and there's the house, all lovingly restored and run as a outdoor education centre and lovingly curated inside. Yeah, looks like I'm going to need a bigger suitcase. And there, the cinema part, yeah, sold his film rights to Green Mansions, and it got made into a Hollywood blockbuster starring Audrey Hepburn and Psycho. I always forget his name. I can't see it from here. Anthony Perkins, of course. So this year, because he's still held in such high esteem in Argentina, there's been loads going on for his centenary. I mean, loads. And I'm happy that I'm kind of connected now to those folks. So I kind of sense that Hudson's being properly recognised and 1 or 2 books have come out over there. Yeah, so I suppose my sense is that Hudson has also just introduced me to and helped me get to know not only his female colleagues, because I've been going through his letters, and there's really nothing quite like letters to bring folk to life, and the kind of, I suppose, the characters and just the everyday human interest stuff, as well as all the big world event stuff. And he introduced me to this wonderful man called Don Roberto Cunningham Graham, who's a Hispanic Scot aristocrat, and he was the first socialist in Parliament. Absolutely extraordinary man. Try to imagine the Billy Connolly of the late Victorian London, going about on a Mustang, an Argentine Mustang in Hyde Park, literally riding his horse to Parliament. And he'd lived the gaucho life, and so he made contact with Hudson. He also made a point of, basically looking up anybody he was interested in. And so he was connected to everyone. There's a particular closeness with Hudson because they had this shared gaucho past. And at the end of Don Roberto's life, and the man was in his mid-80s, it was 1936, the last thing he did was leave Scotland, make that Atlantic crossing again, all the way to Buenos Aires and out onto the Pampas to find Hudson's home. It's a wonderful story, and he died days later, and he was brought back to his ancestral home on the Lake of Menteith in Stirlingshire, and this is a place I know and love. And as a student, I was often there. I remember when the first ospreys came back in the 80s, and seeing them when they were a secret. You weren't allowed to tell anybody you'd seen an osprey at that time. And anyway, Don Roberto was buried in this place I know and love, even though I had no idea about him. In fact, I was actually married on this island. It was only anyway, there's a wee private humanist ceremony. And again, before I knew Don Roberto. Anyway, that's me as a student borrowing a fishing boat. And I went there more recently to look at Don Roberto's former home, but he went bankrupt. Anyway, it's a whole ton of things that kind of I found out about these wonderful people. And so what I was interested to do to bring Hudson to life was to also bring to life the people with whom he associated, almost as a counterpoint, you know, to put him in context. Because I think it's actually what those people thought of him that matters most. And so yes, I've through this I've made friendships with all sorts of fascinating folk, and I found the Anglo-Argentine Society, and been able to, you know, I think, you know, recognize this wonderful joint heritage thing he has, which interests me because of my own, I suppose, and just the thing of having to leave home to work, you know, to go somewhere else to work. Yeah. And so I've been also, you know, been sort of trying to restore Hudson to his rightful place in ornithology, because a thing happened, which was that he got utterly sidelined, and I think really misrepresented. And I think it's to do with the fact that you don't achieve what he and his colleagues achieved without upsetting a lot of very important people. And that remains true to this day. But he was revered by John Galsworthy. He was given the Nobel Prize for Literature. He turned down a knighthood for literature. This man was, you know, the bee's knees, and he thought Hudson was the best. And so his testimony, I think, really counts for a lot. I mean, these aren't faint words, you know. This is, he thought, the most valuable writer our age possesses. And this man, and this is Edward Garnett, the man I mentioned, the ringleader of the literary circle, fascinating character, could really, you know, spot talent and hone books. He was a mentor to all those amazing literary figures. But what's key is that not only did he love Hudson's work, it was this thing he says about no man's personality ever fascinated me like Hudson, and he knew everyone. So that's the thing. There's something about Hudson. Anyway, I compared and contrasted Hudson and Richard Jefferies, who was an earlier nature writer, belonged to, I suppose, the mid and early Victorian, and a time when all naturalists went about with guns. And that seems to me that there was a baton handed over between these two men. And from the, you know, the gun carrier to the non-gun carrying conservationist, and that's what Hudson really was. He was a pioneer of that movement away from collector naturalists to protector naturalists, that not everything needed to be shot and brought home to be studied. In fact, Hudson, you know, really pioneered this thing. No, go and see the things when they're alive. And so that was a big change, you know, and that came with some pain for a lot of people. Anyway, so yeah, I've mocked this up. I like this picture you see. I took this picture on the beach in Norfolk of a horse rider, and I think it captures, I think, you know, the thing of the ocean, the thing of the sky, and the big skies of the pampas and the open spaces, but yeah, we spoke about, you know, the David, about the film writing or screenwriting, and I can't help. I actually studied film at uni. I'm a bit frustrated screenwriter myself, and I can totally see the spaghetti western in all this. You know, the gothic western of the Eastwood-like figure who rides out of the western horizon with a mission. In this case, to save the birds. So anyway, on a Christmassy theme, as we approach Christmas, here's Mr. Hudson up in lights in the house meeting room at the party. And here he is, meeting your gaze as an old man. So thanks to him, and thanks to you. And I'll be very happy to chat more.
Well, you know, I must say, what a fascinating man is all I can say. Actually, can you stop sharing your screen for a second?
Yeah.
What a fascinating man, and thank you very much for championing this guy, because, you know, I got to know about him when I got this book one of the kind of, I don't know if you can see Birds in London, which is what you had in your talk. Um, and to me, this guy was the original urban birder, and I read this book, and after watching, your presentation, it's obvious that this guy was totally and utterly ahead of his time. Totally. And what I find fascinating about him is the fact that there's lots of parallels. For example, you mentioned, when I spoke with Tessa Bose regarding the formation of the RSPB and how in reality it was formed by women. And I was quite angry that day saying, well, how come there's no pictures of these women or statues or anything, any tributes to these women in the lodge, the RSPB's headquarters? It's only a load of old guys, gentry. Where are they? And there's a parallel because, W.H. Hudson was also an outsider. He also did things differently in the fact that he wasn't the classic conservationist that was in this kind of very classist society. Conservation for a long, long time, maybe to this day, still is quite classist. And the fact that he came from another area, and he was talking about protecting birds, talking about albatrosses long before we started talking about them again, in 20, 30 years ago. I mean, I find the guy absolutely amazing, and I actually see a lot of in myself. I can see some sort of relationship there as well. I can understand some elements of him. So yeah, I'm blown away by that, and I could have, I could have listened to a lot more about the man. And I don't even know where to start in terms of asking questions, if I'm honest, because there are so many questions to ask.
Well, I mean, I would just say on the issue of like Hudson being on the wall at the RSVB and others not. To that, I would say he's the only face on the wall, or he was, and I think the reason he's there, because actually even he wouldn't be there, is because the organization, because it's been too busy, just never looked back at its people. It's not what it does. And Hudson's only there because he had such a fan club that this painting was commissioned by this fan club after he died. And the painting is based on a black and white photograph that was taken in the New Forest some years earlier. Anyway, they commissioned this painting and then presented it to the RSPB and said, here. And of course, the RSPB had to put it on the wall. It didn't, I think, proactively choose to do that itself. So had that not happened, I don't think even Hudson would have been on the wall. So, I mean, and in a way, I mean, organizations probably aren't the best people to tell their own stories. I think, it takes a bit of detachment from someone to do it.
I think detachment and also, well, certainly self-awareness. And I get the feeling sometimes that organizations don't have that self-awareness.
Yeah, well, I can't speak for, and I don't speak for the RSVB, but I can see it from their point of view, and I suppose I'm I'm slightly more forgiving, but yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit, yeah, fair cop, but anyway, I think it's been rectified now, and yeah, but I think until you meet people, or until you get to know people, then you do need somebody to make that, I suppose, initiate the contact, if you like, and that's what I'm trying to do. And I think there has been some trite assumptions, I think, and I was guilty of it too, about who these folk were and what they stood for, and I think because I think a lot of people wanted to dismiss them as welfarists or sentimentalists, which is completely unfair because they were about so much more than that. But I think maybe some of that stuck. But anyway, they're just fascinating folk, and I, the challenge is to present them in a way that will engage people's interest. So let's see.
When will your writing regarding W.H. Hudson be made public? When is it going to be published?
The idea is the spring, so April. So let's, yeah. So it's done. I mean, it's written. It's just the bits and pieces now, the post-production stuff. So yeah, it's been a bit of it's taken a long time, but and not, of course, helped by the disruptions, but yeah, I've enjoyed it. It's been very, very absorbing, and slightly mad, getting so much into not only the heads of other people, but another time, trying to conjure and imagine this thing of those odds, the way that we think we're up against it now. Consider then in operating in that world in which the cultural norms were just to kill everything. It was so normalized and everywhere, and there were no laws, or very few laws, and certainly not enforceable laws to help you. So you really were starting from scratch. So yeah, fair play. I think we need to not only take encouragement and inspiration from them, but just take the time to recognize and thank. I think it's important.
Well, I mean, I say it's a fascinating subject, and as I say, he's a person that I'd love to learn more about. And I think from what you've said, he sounds, as I said, way ahead of his time and totally amazing. But we're talking about time. We're actually kind of getting out of time ourselves. Conor, if you could be anywhere in the world, where would you be right now?
Well, if I could be teleported, because then I wouldn't feel bad about flying, I would go back to Cuba in a heartbeat, of the places I've been, and certainly at this time of year. I just thought Havana was just, I mean, it's unlike anything. And then a place that I've not been is actually back to Uganda. I've still never found the time to do that, and I would love to do that and go back to where I was born. So sorry, that's cheating. That's two answers. But anyway, somewhere I've not been, and actually no, I've been to both of those places. Anyway, it would be a choice between those.
Okay, and if you can, have you a favorite bird?
Well, at the risk of being predictable, it's obviously the goshawk, and the reason being that I was kind of I felt I kind of came under the spell of this bird, and again, I'm still championing it, and hello. But if I'm allowed, what I'll admit, and maybe this speaks to my own fickleness, is that if you'd asked me that question at different times in my life, I would have given you a different answer. So I've kind of been through hoopoe. What happens is you see a bird one day and you think, God, that's the best bird, isn't it? I mean, and I love the hoopoe because not only does it look amazing, it's got this thing of I noticed that when it was flying, they've got that really kind of effortful fly. Not only does it effortful, but they grunt with the effort of it. So if you've ever been close to a hoopoe, you might have heard this. But then I've had swallows being my favorite, and when I was young, I think peregrine was my favorite, and I think my favorite song, again, that's so difficult, but nothing. I used to champion the wren, and it's because the way that this tiny wee thing at any time of year and in any place almost can suddenly just throw that at you. And I love that, so it can be like, even can be the depths of winter and you can be in a wood and a wren will do that. And that's great. So anyway, there, I'm having four.
Good, good. I love it. Okay, well, this is the final In Conservation with of this year for those living in the future. Don't worry about it. This is just for the people here and now. But next year in January, we kick off on the 9th of January with Mike Unwin, who's going to be talking about Around the World in 80 Birds. He's just written a book of the same title. On the 12th of January, we've got Ian Parsons, who's been with us before actually, but this time he's talking about wildlife in Britain through the seasons, and he's written a book called Seasonality. And then on the 19th of June, we've got a guy called Mike Toms, who works with the BTO, British Trust for Ornithology, good friend of mine. And he's written the sequel, unfortunately. And I say unfortunate because it's called Into the Red, and it's about declining birds, and there's more of them, I'm afraid. And on the 23rd of January, we've got Mark Haidt, who's a good friend of mine from Holland, and has written this, or created this new handbook on European birds, which is all photographs. And I'll tell you what, 2 more for January. Dr. Karen Backer on the 26th of January, talking about sounds that wildlife makes, and also the correlation between the internet and how we appreciate nature. And finally, on the 30th of January, we've got a guy called Arjun. I can't pronounce his surname yet, I haven't rehearsed it yet. And he's talking about his big year. He's the champion in terms of numbers of birds seen in the whole year. So we've got a mixed bag in January. So really hope to see you all back in January. And I'd like to, I know it's early, but say or wish you the blessing that Santa brings you all that you require for Christmas this year. And let's hope that 2023 is a better year for everyone. But Conor, once again, I really appreciate you coming here. And we didn't even have time to have proper questions. We're going to do that though. We're going to do that next in the Q&A. And if you're not a member of the RSPB, if you're not a member of the Urban Bird of World community, then you may not be able to see that. So you need to become a member, and you can see all the Q&As of all the previous In Conservation Withs. But anyway, Conor, thank you very much for tonight.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
And Zoomers, thank you again. Wish you all the best for 2023. Thanks for supporting In Conservation With during this year and previous years as well. And all I can say to everyone at the moment out there is keep looking up.